it's been a very intensive and interesting 3 days, so I'm very happy that we have survived this far, and I think that we have been quite inspired. These lights are absolutely horrible, and we can't see who is there in the audience, but I trust somebody is there.
I can see that.
I see Rob waving, and yeah. So this is the closing session, and the unenviable task for trying to summarize the extremely rich discussions that we have had over the 3 days is with Uma Lele. And Uma is, of course, many of you know her already. She's a very prominent development and environment thinker who has been with the World Bank but has been in many other capacities also. So we asked her to be the critical observer. I like these kind of terms, actually. A critical observer, somebody who observes but just doesn't take your word for it, but is critically observing what we are doing. And Uma has been, and she has had a team with her to basically to follow what happens in this conference and to come up with observations, critical observations about what transpired. So I would like to ask Uma to let us hear what you found.
To say something first, no? Me first, okay. Thank you. I'm going to stand up because sometimes you can either see me or hear me, so I'm hoping that you will be able to do both. Do I have to turn anything on, or can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for asking me to do this. I have mixed feelings about it because it's not an easy job, and I wondered why I was being asked to do this. Most people know that I can be quite critical, so I thought, okay, given that I've been being given a title to be a critical observer, now I can be critical without feeling guilty about it. So that's what I'm going to do. And I have a large number of people from the GF who have been helping me with this. So if it goes well, you can give me credit for it. If it doesn't go well, you know who to blame. So I'm going to start by the really wonderful comments that Andrew Steer made on the first day. And he raised a number of big questions on climate change issues. I'm not going to read all of them, but I think what is clear is that we are in a very different world than we were before. And many of the changes are no more incremental changes. They are very substantial changes. And so he challenged the evaluation community to say, given the changes, what are you guys doing to deal with the challenges? So we were listening to these presentations from the point of view of the challenges he posed. I also thought it was interesting that he said, don't be a boring evaluator, and also be relevant, but also be a good communicator, because communication matters. Now, I'm not as good a communicator as Andrew is, so please forgive me if my presentation is not as exciting as his. But I thought I'll start with some provocative slides to show you how the world of international cooperation after Second World War started, which was with the Bretton Woods meetings. It's very inspiring to go there. I was there a few weeks ago, and I must say that after working in the World Bank for many years, I was really glad that I went there to see the spirit of cooperation which led to the establishment of Bretton Woods institutions. But now the world is very different, and actually on the day I was speaking on international organizations, the BRICS Bank was formed. I think it tells us a lot about the complete change in the dynamism, growth, population growth, demand, emission changes that are going to occur, emission growth that is going to occur, etc. And so the question is, if we think about those changes, to what extent what we learned in the last 2 or 3 days addresses those kinds of changes. So it's from that point of view that we were listening to these presentations, and you can see what a daunting task it is. A large number of presentations in many different sectors, plenaries, etc. I'm not going to read all of it, but it's for your records to know how much how many areas that we covered. The one big message that comes out of this is that the evaluation community has come a really long way. And I can say that with some confidence because I used to do evaluations in IG about 10 years ago. So my baseline is 10 years ago, what was happening on evaluation techniques and what's happening now. And I must say that there are lots of new techniques, and I made a list of a lot of them, which you will see. But I think there are other messages that came out of these presentations. One is that evaluations are still largely done at the project level, that the projects aren't really realizing all their potential, and I think I'll elaborate on some of this, that the big challenges call for new approaches to evaluations in monitoring and evaluation. Again, Andrew Steer was very provocative in challenging us to think about new approaches to evaluation. So what did the conference contribute from that point of view? I was quite inspired by Rob's presentation, actually, on presenting the findings of OPS 4 and 5, because he did try to address that question that Andrew raised about projects, moving from projects to programs, to replication, mainstreaming, scaling up, etc., etc. Market changes and addressing those issues. Then I think the question is, to what extent is that something which is only confined to GEF, or is it also happening in other international organizations? And I think some of the evaluation presentations that were made did address these questions. So I will come to those a little later. But I was also taking my inspiration from the 3 themes of the conference, which were policy, mitigation, and adaptation. What we found is that in each of these areas, and we made a list of everything in terms of new methods, conceptual tools, that were being presented. I'm not going to read this list, but it's available for you, and maybe we can add to it to see what had changed in terms of evaluation techniques, etc. One other major change I found was that big data are now available, and we are probably not making as much use of it as possible, particularly to do evaluations at scale. And I know that IEG has been doing some of this, GEF has been doing it, but obviously there is huge scope for doing evaluations using big data. And all the IT technology, crowdsourcing, all sorts of new technical possibilities. But the big question again is at the country level. And I think that this is a message that I kept on hearing again and again. Lack of capacity in countries, lack of data at the country level, even to do ground truthing of a great deal of data that are now available. And some people were saying the data are available, but there aren't people in developing countries to be able to analyze them, etc. So that's a theme you will hear again and again. One thing that is again different compared to 2004 when I quit doing evaluations was that everybody now talks about theory of change. And this was not the case when I was doing my evaluations. I was doing them more by instinct rather than by theory of change. And there are, of course, a number of advantages to theory of change. Again, I'm not going to read them, but you can see what they are. And I think one other big change is that people are talking about using evaluations from the design stage to see how we can start learning as we go along, how we can change our assumptions as we learn more, including in the theory of change. And therefore, what would it mean in terms of how evaluations are done in a dynamic, evolutionary way, in a way that, as we know, working for international organizations often doesn't happen. There are often no baselines, not much capacity in the countries to start evaluations when the projects are being designed. So the focus on learning is something which came up again and again. But there are also risks in using theory of change. And I thought that some of the presentations, again, made by GF, I'm not being biased in favor of GF, but I think the idea of theory of no change and why is there no change, what does it mean in terms of obstacles to change, is something as a nice way, a flip side of looking at theory of change, and also addressing questions which are much larger at the systemic level. So that probably can get us away from this question of tunnel vision, looking for the key where the light is, which can happen sometimes by looking at theory of change, etc. So lot of thinking in that regard. Now, when I was looking at these three themes, my general impression was that although Andrew mentioned these numbers, Ken mentioned the numbers of billions and trillions of dollars being spent on subsidies, but there really aren't many evaluations of what is happening with subsidies, what can happen if we change the subsidy regimes, which countries are doing it, what impact is it having on climate change, emissions, fiscal resources, incentives, being thrown out of power after elections, etc. And we do really need political economy analysis of policy change in a big way. Otherwise, we'll just be doing micromanaging of little projects rather than looking at the use of billions and trillions of dollars. So I thought that was a gap in the presentations. And I mentioned some of the areas where people mentioned how policies are being looked at. Ken mentioned it, the IDB study mentioned it, etc. Now, the general impression I had was that obviously doing evaluations of mitigation projects is much easier. I say that with a little hesitation because we know the difficulties of measuring emissions and reference lines and changes, etc. But compared to what I'm going to say about adaptation, you will see that doing evaluations on mitigation in general seems to be easier for a variety of reasons that I have mentioned in this PowerPoint. But I think what is interesting is that many people in the sessions kept on saying that there is no coherence among international organizations in how they are looking at emissions, their reductions, how they are measuring it. Almost each climate fund seems to have its own approach of doing it compared to what others are doing. And so there was a continuous call to say that we need efforts to have more coherence in the way international organizations are addressing issues of measurement, standards, norms, and guidance, not just to international organizations, but particularly to developing countries where there is much less capacity. Then there were, I think, some interesting approaches to evaluation of how MDBs are addressing questions of mainstreaming mitigation. And the outcomes of the evaluations are not all that encouraging in terms of how well mainstreaming is happening, but at least we have the evaluation techniques to be able to look at whether international organizations are mainstreaming their approaches to climate change, particularly issues of mitigation. Now, adaptation, I think it kept on coming up as a really big challenge. And I was surprised to see that, I had read Rob Vandenwerk's first book that he had edited on the first conference on held in Alexandria, where there was very good discussion of how difficult it is to think about adaptation, resilience, how even anthropologists look at it differently than sociologists, than ecologists, etc. And that had really struck in my mind, and I was surprised to see that we haven't made much progress since that conference on how to look at adaptation. And it's obviously a crying need, and I urge evaluators to spend much more time looking at it in terms of what needs to happen. So what emerged from these presentations? So I think I'm again listing some of the things that came out of the presentation. I'm not going to read each one of those slides, but I wanted to make sure that they were available for the record. Now, because there was so much confusion about what is adaptation, what is due to climate change, as distinct from just the usual community development projects that people like me have been looking at for 40 years, I asked people in the CGIAR who are working on climate change issues to tell me how they are looking at climate change. And I thought this slide was very good because they show at the bottom, the first half, the two parts are about the regular community development kind of activities they do, and the two top sections show what is particular about climate change that they are doing by superimposing on normal community development projects the elements that come from climate change. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we need more of in evaluations of adaptation. And here they've broken it down even more. So you can see there some interventions are weather related, some are soil related, etc., etc. And I think the more we break down the problem of adaptation in these details, the more information we'll have to be able to look at adaptation in the context of resilience and the usual development challenges that people have felt. Now, I also thought it was striking that many people use rainfall variability data often, and they often refer to it as that happening as a result of climate change. And what is clear is that first, we don't have a lot of data on rainfall variability as a result of climate change. In many cases, we actually don't have much rainfall data at the local level. So we can use what data are available on climate variability, but we must make sure that we don't get confused between that due to climate change and just rainfall variability. And I think this was very striking in some of the maps that I was looking at. So climate variability is not the same as climate change, and they are very closely related, which is what causes confusion on adaptation research. So the other thought that came to my mind is the evaluations needed of low-hanging fruit to achieve impacts at scale. And I thought the light bulb idea was a very good one that Rob had mentioned. But are there other things that are low-hanging fruit which can be scaled up and one can have much bigger impact? That's not the way we normally look at evaluations. We look at the portfolios and then we say which one of those we are going to evaluate, etc. But this is one different way of looking at it. Now, going back to Andrew's concerns about the large issues that we are facing, this is a figure that I had prepared jointly with Aaron when we were preparing a paper that Greg Ingram, my former boss, asked me to write on the environmental architecture. And I had sent it to Bob Picciotto, who said, "What is this nonsense? This is all a bowl of noodles." And I said, that's exactly what it is, bowl of noodles. So this was about 2 years ago, and I think probably the fragmentation in climate funds has perhaps even increased. And I think that's very symptomatic of the fact that there is huge need for coherence in the international architecture on climate change, because what is happening is that as a result of this fragmentation, we are really pushing more and more responsibility for coherence and coordination on developing countries. They have to figure out about the zillions of climate funds and decide how they are going to coordinate. And especially in a context where they have very limited capacity, I think those of us who work in international organizations, owe it to developing countries to see that there is more coherence and more evaluations. And actually, a lot of the responses to questions came up with ideas for what should be looked at. For instance, on the evaluation of what I call the messy environmental architecture, do we really need all these many funds as distinct from having fewer funds? The role of the traditional organizations compared to new funds. This is something that has been coming up for the last 10 years, and the evaluation I had done of the global partnerships showed that the proliferation just never stops. So I think that's one of the things that needs to be looked at the level of the architecture. Then I think there are these multiple challenges in climate change and development evaluations. One of them, which keeps on coming up, is the capacity issue, combining big data with small data, the frequent lack of ground level data. In general, I think I found less discussion of socio-economic issues, socio-political issues in the evaluation findings that I heard here. And there is a great deal that I think people who are working in the development area have to offer in the areas which are very pertinent to looking at environmental evaluations on issues of decentralization, on elite capture, on intra-household decision-making, etc. So I hope that there'll be more integration of evaluation experiences and literature from development to environment. So how can the evaluation community help more? That was the challenge that Andrew had thrown to us. And so evaluation community can communicate better, and I liked very much the presentation on the light bulbs. I know light bulbs are easier to tell a story about than it is on some other evaluations that GF does, but it's a good idea. I think we should all start communicating better. Understand the consequences of our recommendations to operational people, and translate what our recommendations mean in terms of operational strategies. Do evaluations faster and quicker. I think, many evaluations take forever, and then decision makers sometimes give up. Focus on learning and build capacity in developing countries. This last is a great passion of mine, and I can't emphasize it more. So thanks to everyone who took notes, and they were all kind of spies listening to all the presentations, being flies on the wall, but they made huge contributions to this presentation. So if there are any weaknesses, those are mine, and everything you have seen would not have been possible without their help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uma. I knew that you wouldn't let us down. It's a brilliant summary of what has happened in over 3 days, and lots of insights into also what way we should be going. At this point of time, I would like to ask if there are any additional comments or from the floor. Yes, please.
I guess the question to ask at this point would be, for this crowd, evaluators mostly, and those who are back at home, would be listening to this and moving forward, would be how much rigor should we expect in our work moving forward? How much confidence should we take moving forward, given all the uncertainties that we have, particularly in the area of evaluating adaptation? On the climate eval community, you would have all these questions every single day. What are we looking for? Do we want to make sure that we are as perfect as a rigor is expected in evaluation? So the question for you, Uma, would be, from what you've seen, from what we've heard, from what has emerged from this, with all the uncertainties that we have, yes, we do know how to evaluate mitigation, but in adaptation, there's still a lot of gray area. So what would you say with respect to that moving forward? Just to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, David. One of your final points was that you have to do faster but better evaluations. That's not always the easy one to combine. Shall we see if anybody else has a... Timo. Yeah.
Timo Leiter from GIZ. Thank you very much, Uma, for your responses. I've got one comment. You said that you had seen little progress on adaptation M&E since the first Alexandria conference, and I tend to slightly disagree, because in 2008 there was hardly any specialized literature on adaptation M&E, and particularly in the last 2 years we've seen a lot of publications, guidebooks. So I think we do have made some progress since Alexandria, but we are still grappling with how do we measure adaptation outcomes. So I agree with the outcome, but it's still a challenging part. And I fully agree with you, the mitigation has the metrics on greenhouse gas emissions, which in principle is or easier from the concept to measure. The details are still difficult. So mitigation, I think, yes, is ahead of adaptation. Adaptation is making slight progress. It has made some progress, but maybe we are still not where we want to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Julian Bajendera from Uganda, working for P&E, Provide and Equip Consultancy Firm. Thank you very much. I liked your presentation. I liked your recommendations particularly. Somewhere you mentioned capacity building, and it's good that you are emphasizing it. But within the presentations, I saw you emphasizing capacity for data collection and capacity for, analysis? What I wanted to emphasize is to build a case for capacity for data use. We have concentrated on these other aspects, and we build capacity, and we have these methodologies, but once people do not appreciate how can I use this data at my local level, as a farmer, as a community leader, then the data quality will remain poor, and they pay less attention to data unless they appreciate how can I, particularly myself at my level, use this data, and then that goes up the hierarchy till the national level. Thank you.
Maybe I should answer these three, because my brain is getting saturated, so I don't remember all the questions. I think the first was how can we move forward? But I'll answer that by answering the second and the third question on adaptation, etc. I think if the definition of adaptation is that it's a process which evolves over time, etc., then in a way, search for outcomes also has to be a process, because the outcomes themselves will change over time, right? And the more I have thought about development over the last 40 years or so that I've been writing about this, the first book was on design of rural development in Africa, the more convinced I am that unless we build capacity at the local level to address the questions that they need to address themselves, we really can't solve these very complex problems. No amount of technical assistance from outside is going to be able to deal with adaptation issues where there is so much diversity. I mean, it's just bewildering to know the extent of diversity, right? So the attempt always in our minds has to be, how do we build capacity in developing countries? And I can give you some wonderful examples from India. The Swaminathan Foundation was doing some very good work with fishermen on the coast on using telephones to tell them about wavelengths and the danger of going out fishing. And there was a paper published, if I remember correctly, in Science, which showed that because of that information, less people died as a result at the time of tsunami because they didn't go out to fish. And now I have seen programs from the Swaminathan Foundation where they are sending information to farmers who then call back to say, I got this recommendation on agronomical practices, etc., but I have some further questions. So there is a radio program which responds to the needs of farmers on a regular basis. So, there is a lot of experimentation going on in developing countries in using modern technology, working with farmers. And I think we should try to, that is where I think there is a lot of scope for exchange of information to see what we can do with new technology with poor farmers for them to use this more effectively. But I think in adaptation, if we started looking for permanent outcomes, I think we would look at illusion. But if we really looked at the process of adjustment of poor people to the circumstances that they face and how are they doing it, then I think we would be addressing adaptation questions in a much more relevant way from their point of view. And lately I came across this example which I briefly mentioned in Orissa, where there was a big hurricane, and they knew, first of all, the weather data were so good that they were fully prepared for a no death, zero death policy that they had declared. And they came to know that, and they were completely prepared for moving close to 1 million people to deal with the hurricanes. And they were told by the people who predict hurricanes that it's coming 48 hours earlier or something like this. And they had to change their plans, but they managed to move all these people, save them from this hurricane. And then apparently 500,000 hectares of land was lost as a result of the hurricane, at least for a year or two. I haven't been following up on this story as much as I would like. But you see these multiple multiple shocks to poor people mean that the capacity to deal with them is so horrendous, and we really need to spend much more time in understanding what the capacity implications of those are, including on weather data, institutional capacity, human capital, political will, information, a whole lot of things that I think we can do a lot more of than we do now.
Thank you very much. Okay, please, Ramesh.
I'm Ramesh Deshpande, former World Bank staff. These presentations or so far, it's from mainly from MDB's angle, how we should behave, how we should change. What I feel is that a lot of voluntary effort is going on, and we are really not capturing that experimentation, as you rightly said. So what are those mechanisms by which MDGs or various climate change funds can capture information about what voluntary effort is going on? That is one. And secondly, we should not assume we are going to change the world ourselves whole. I think we had to introduce market in getting projects. In the sense, people come with viable proposals, you select those proposals, you prioritize them, and then you fund them. And you can do on a equity basis, so that if there are benefits, people will pay you back. So there has to be built in some kind of cost recovery, kind of market selection, kind of market funding, which seems to be missing from the approaches discussed so far. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, please.
Thank you. It's about data. You have mentioned several of the factors that are missed in the chain, several of the links. And you have said, how many people have said that data could be obtained from alternative sources, like, for instance, crowd or cloud sourcing or big data. That's in general indirect sources, but as we all know, climate change is a biophysical factor overall, although its causes might be social or human-made. Why do not invest hardly on climate data gathering, climate stations, or in general, monitoring data? That's crucial. Whatever grounded decision that we would need to make to counter climate change must be based on reliable data. And it's not only a point in a timeline, but must be successively collected. So we need time series. And that's money. And that's investment. And that's investment in national organizations that collect data during this timeline to make it reliable. And that's money. Essentially, it's money. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree.
You want to comment?
I want to add something. I want to add something. I say this because we work on research. We do climate change research. And that is precisely what we are missing the most, although we are also trying to build up into that base. Thanks.
I completely agree with you that, data requires organization and capacity, etc. But it's quite interesting that in the post-2015 agenda, there's a huge emphasis being placed on data, which is a right emphasis. I'm glad that after 50 years of external assistance, we've been putting so much emphasis on data. But we often don't realize what capacity and political commitment and administrative capacity it requires to collect and maintain and analyze data. And in a way, that itself is a reflection of development. So, in a way, we are demanding a lot of data from places where there is relatively little capacity. That's the reason why I think institutional capacity and human capital and, mobilizing all kinds of stakeholders, not just the public sector, but NGOs, private sector, etc., is essential if we are going to get to tap as much of the data as are available and to make sure that they are available to people whose decisions matter in terms of their survival, etc. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we are, it's not only your brain that is nearing saturation. I think most of our brains are nearing saturation. So thanks so much for thinking through these things, Uma, and so on. Yeah. And I would now like to ask, it's a fantastic thing that we have the CEO of the GEF, Naoko Ishii, here. Hey, that's the whole that's the whole point of why we are evaluating, that it feeds back into the programming and so on. And Naoko, please, can you say a few words?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Juha. And thank you so much for having me here at this closing session of the important workshop. I am really sorry that I missed the opening session. In fact, I was in Bangkok and just came back yesterday. What happened in Bangkok? Well, actually, the GEF is nominated or adopted or selected as a financial mechanism of a newly adopted Mercury Convention. We call it Minamata Convention of the Mercury. So GEF's mandate is expanding. And in fact, one thing I want to share with you from Bangkok is that there is a very strong consensus among the participants that Mercury issue will be much better addressed if we take an integrated or synergistic approach with actually the climate change, particularly energy efficiency, because the mercury is used to produce the electricity and also some kind of industrial process as a catalyst, but also in case of artisanal small-scale gold mining, which mercury is well used, actually badly used. It's actually the issue is not only mercury, it's more like a biodiversity, land degradation, and the broader sustainable development issue, so post-2015 agenda. So actually very strong message from this Mercury Convention team is that apparently synergistic, holistic approach is important. It's the way that Jeff will deliver more contribution to this global agenda, and it seems your work will be, the more and more work will be coming to you, the evaluators. So that's the one message coming from Bangkok. I think this the conference took a very important time of this global policy discussion because things are quite urgent, as we know, and we are really in the discussion of post-2015 sustainable development, but also climate and agreement in Paris. So that we have a quite an important agenda going forward, which requires really a urgent approach. We, Jeff, adopted Jeff 2020 and Jeff 6, which actually takes the more integrated, more systemic, and more holistic approach, knowing that the resources are so limited, but some of the global issue requires a urgent action out of this entire areas. So how we can deliver the systemic and the scalable impacts out of these limited resources in urgent matter before everything becomes so irreversible. So I think that we have a huge mission going forward. And here, in a sense, that Jeff recipient countries have already taken maybe ahead of us, because under Jeff 5, actually OPS 5 notified that tells us that half of the operation already taken a multifocal approach, so that on the ground there is already a demand, and I think there is already action taken by the countries that this holistic synergistic approach is very much needed. So, and also along the same line, we, the Jeff 6 and Jeff 2020, adopted a more integrated approach, and there are three interesting kind of flagship program the Council agreed to go forward. This is the Sustainable City program that take the deforestation out of supply chain program, and the Sustainable City program. All of them requires quite a different way of doing business. We want to take much more systemic, holistic, integrated approach, and also want to take a little bit more driver-focused approach rather than just a symptom response approach. So all in all, what this new trend means to you, the evaluators, what we expect from you, what you can do for us and for the world, I think that is a very, I assume it's a bit that the discussion of the last 3 days, and I was quite pleased that during the last council meeting, which took place last week here in Washington, Juha, that made a very strong point that the IEO, the Independent Evaluation Office of the Jeff, is very much committed to make their work, to emphasize the utility, to make their work useful to the countries and to the community. So I'm very encouraged with that comment. And also there is a very strong call from the council members. They would like to see more and more feedback loop, so that the evaluation, the results of evaluation be used for the better design of the projects going forward. So there's a very strong support and request and encouragement from the council and the countries that the utility of the evaluation, particularly the feedback loop. But also there's another thing, while the council are really excited about integrated approach, they are also very keen to see how to measure the results, how to measure this integrated approach, which is kind of new. That could we have a good way of measuring, a good way of evaluating those integrated approach. So I just want to convey the very strong encouragement or just a request from the community to all of you. So we very much looking forward to the outcome of this conference, which is absolutely timely, and very much wanted to work very, very close with everybody in this community. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Naoko. Fantastic. And we do want to be useful. And we are all in this business for a reason, because we think that these are very, very important things. We are actually, this is about our own futures, about how our world and our lives shape up. And we hope, of course, that the evaluation community and the evaluations that we do will contribute to that. That is the most important thing. Now, I'm absolutely sure that nobody will hold it against me if I'm not going to have a long speech. And I'm not going to have a long speech because I'm flanked by two brilliant ladies who have said it all already. There's a somewhat self-serving, self-congratulatory slide which lists a number of people, including myself for some reason, as thanks. But the thanks go much further than that. I would like to single out Rob Vandenberg, though, because this whole thing started with Rob in 2008 and before that. I had a windfall, so I'm in a wonderful position of coming and taking over something that is almost done in September. So I don't want to take credit of any of this. So Rob, thanks very much. Most importantly, however, the thanks go to everybody who participated, to people who contributed. We have our group of supporters and donors, and Monica and Timo are here, and we are extremely grateful for that also, but also for everybody who was present here and who discussed, who presented, who contributed to our furthering our thoughts on these issues. These are important things. And we shall prevail and we shall continue, I think. Andrew Steer reminded us in the beginning of the conference how we have to be better communicators, how we have to be more charismatic, whatever. And we got to work on that. It's not trivial. I mean, we got to work on that, for heaven's sake, because these are important things. But, okay, so now I'm getting, off on my role. So I shall just close the conference by thanking once again everybody. You will hear from us. But more importantly, please hear from each other. Let us know what happened. But form networks, form and continue your alliances, continue doing what you are doing and collaborate. And it's not the fact that we will have another conference 6 years from now or whatever. We may have that. It will be great. But before that, we have to do things. Thank you so much. The conference is closed.